Welcome back. This is Dr. Gabriel John Roberts, and I'm here to talk to you today about critical thinking through conceptualization and beyond. Now, critical thinking is one of those areas that has become increasingly popular over the years, and so you're probably already familiar with the term and maybe some of the ideas about how to look at problems, shining light on them from different angles. So what we're going to do today is to look at the various critical thinking skills that you may be aware of, but look at them through the lens of the educational context and consider how we can actually use these critical thinking skills in the development of our own educational systems, and how we can encourage our students or learners to actually use critical thinking skills themselves. Once we've considered the critical thinking skills, we'll move on to looking at conceptualization, looking at what we are able to learn through the employment of critical thinking skills and drawing our own conclusions and beginning to think about the next steps in the process as well. So developing a concept, analyzing the concept, and then applying it. So that could be to a lesson, to a scheme of work, or whatever it happens to be. Now, for those of you who are familiar with any of the theories behind education, you may well be familiar with some of the phrases that I've already used, and indeed Bloom's taxonomy. It's a tool that was developed way back in 1956 and is still very much in use today, which speaks to its popularity and the enduring uses that people have for Bloom's taxonomy. Um, it's been tweaked and revised, improved many times over, and it's always being slightly sort of changed. A quick Google search on Bloom's taxonomy will find all kinds of adaptations of this. But essentially, it's a pyramid, as you can see, which forms the basis of learning and takes you through the 6 different steps. The first one is remember. It used to be known as knowledge, but this is one of the developments where it's been tweaked to be more dynamic and verbs are used at each stage instead. Remember requires learners to recall facts and basic concepts, and the verbs that you could use when you want to motivate your class would be things like to define, duplicate, list, memorize, repeat, or state. Once our learners are able to remember specific information, it's time to build on that with the next layer, which would be to understand. This would be to be able to explain ideas or concepts. You might want learners to classify things, describe, discuss, explain, identify, locate things in a text perhaps, recognize things, report on events, select or even translate. Once our learners are able to understand these things, then it's time for them to begin to apply concepts using the information in new situations. The verbs there would be execute, implement, solve problems, to use, which is quite broad, but to use the information in a new situation, demonstrate something, interpret ideas, operate, schedule, or sketch things out for the learning of others, perhaps. So that covers the first 3, which are what we may consider to be sort of basic learning or basic understanding. The top 3 categories are the more kind of advanced learning areas, and that includes to analyze, to be able to draw connections between ideas, to compare and contrast, differentiate, to distinguish one thing that may be quite distinct from another, to examine ideas, experiment, question, and test hypotheses, for example. Next up, after analyze, we have evaluate, where we provide value to something or give value to something, to justify a stand, to justify a decision. And the verbs there we might have would be to appraise, to argue, defend, judge, select, support ideas or support arguments, value, critique, and weigh up and evaluate the other side of arguments, perhaps. And finally, right up the top, we have the domain create, to produce a new or original piece of work. This is where we are showing the kind of culmination of the other 5 areas, and the verbs there might be to design, to assemble, to construct, to conjecture or guess at something, to develop, formulate, to write something new, or to investigate a new problem, as you will do in your dissertation. Sorry to bring that up so early. Okay, so that is a very brief examination of Bloom's taxonomy. But the things that we're really interested in, the concept of critical thinking and conceptualization, will be these areas: apply, analyze, and evaluate. And this is what we are going to examine in more depth today. And to do that, we're going to look at this study from Barnaby, conducted in 2014, where students and tutors in an educational establishment were all asked to define what they thought critical thinking skills were. So, from right to left, we have problem solving, reasoning, self-regulation, or kind of knowing where boundaries are, perhaps, identification of issues, identification of things that need to be addressed, or identification of things that work, deduction, where A plus B equals AB, and being able to sort of fill in gaps of information in that way. Explanation was the next skill. Interpretation, where you can read results but you can understand the sort of picture behind the words as well. Reflection, which is something that is key in university, where you look back in order to push things forward, and we'll look at cycles for reflection a little bit later on in this lecture. Inference, where again we can sort of try to understand around certain areas that we don't know, inferring information. For example, if there's a word that we don't know, then we would infer the meaning of that word. And right at the top, what we can see are evaluation and analysis. Both of these skills being identified in Barnaby's study as being the top critical thinking skills for both students and for tutors, although there was some parity with reflection and interpretation and problem solving for the tutors. So to take this a step further, we need to examine this paper from Dwyer et al., where they provide us a series of activities that make up the core critical thinking skills of analysis, evaluation, and inference. So here are their definitions within the paper. Analysis is to identify the intended and actual inferential relationships among statements, questions, concepts, descriptions, or other forms of representation intended to express beliefs, judgments, experiences, reasons, or information. Analysis also covers examining ideas to determine the role various expressions play or are intended to play in the context of argument or reasoning or persuasion, to compare or contrast ideas, concepts, or statements, to identify issues or problems and determine their component parts, and also to identify the conceptual relationships of those parts to each other and to the whole. It also covers detecting arguments given a set of statements or other forms of representation to determine whether or not the set expresses or is intended to express a reason or reasons in support of contesting some claim or opinion or point of view. Analysing arguments, given the expression of a reason or reasons intended to support or contest some claim, opinion or point of view, to identify and differentiate A, the intended main conclusion, B, the premises or reasons advanced in support of the main conclusion, C, further premises and advanced reasons as backup or support for those premises and reasons intended as supporting the main conclusion, D, additional unexpressed elements of that reasoning, such as intermediary conclusions, non-stated assumptions or presuppositions, E, the overall structure of the argument or intended chain of reasoning, and F, any items contained in the body of expressions being examined which are not intended to be taken as part of the reasoning being expressed or its intended background. Moving on to look at their descriptions for evaluation. The first is to assess the credibility of statements or other representations, which are accounts or descriptions of a person's perception, experience, situation, judgment, belief, or opinion, and to assess the logical strength that the actual and intended inferential relationships among statements, descriptions, questions, or other forms of representation. The next is assessing claims, to recognise the factors relevant to assessing the degree of credibility to ascribe to a source of information or opinion, to assess the contextual relevance of questions, information, principles, rules, or procedural directions, to assess the acceptability, the level of confidence to place in the probability or truth of any given representation of an experience, situation, judgment, belief, or opinion. Next up, assessing arguments, to judge whether the assumed acceptability of the premises of an argument justify one's accepting as true, which is deductively certain, or very probably true, which is inductively justified. The expressed conclusion of that argument, to anticipate or to raise questions or objections and to assess whether these point significant weaknesses in the argument being evaluated, to determine whether an argument relies on false or doubtful assumptions or presuppositions, and then to determine how crucially these affect its strength, to judge between reasonable and fallacious inferences, to judge the probative strength of an argument's premises and assumptions with a view towards determining the acceptability of the argument, to determine and judge the probative strength of an argument's intended or unintended consequences with a view toward judging the acceptability of the argument, to determine the extent to which possible additional information might strengthen or weaken an argument. And finally, the Delphi report's definition of inference, the first being to identify and secure elements needed to draw reasonable conclusions, to form conjectures and hypotheses, to consider relevant information and to deduce the consequences flowing from data, statements, principles, evidence, judgments, beliefs, opinions, concepts, descriptions, questions, or other forms of representation. Following that, we have querying evidence, in particular to recognize the premises which require support and to formulate a strategy for seeking and gathering information which might supply that support. In general, to judge that information relevant to deciding the acceptability, plausibility, or relative merits of a given alternative, question, issue, theory, hypothesis, or statement is required, and to determine plausible investigatory strategies for acquiring that information. Next is conjecturing alternatives, to formulate multiple alternatives for resolving a problem, to postulate a series of suppositions regarding a question, to project alternative hypotheses regarding an event, to develop a variety of different plans to achieve some goal, to draw out presuppositions and project the range of possible consequences of decisions, positions, policies, theories, or beliefs. And finally, we have drawing conclusions, to apply appropriate modes of inference in determining what position, opinion, or point of view one should take on a given matter or issue. Given a set of statements, descriptions, questions, or other forms of representation, to deduce with the proper level of logical strength their inferential relationships and the consequences or the presuppositions which they support, warrant, imply, or entail. To employ successfully various subspecies of reasoning, as for example to reason analogically, arithmetically, dialectically, scientifically, etc., to determine which of several possible conclusions is most strongly warranted or supported by the evidence at hand, or which should be rejected or regarded as less plausible by the information given. Now, if you didn't catch all of that, don't worry, this paper will be made available through the electronic learning platform. Okay, so now that we have definitions of the main critical thinking skills, analysis, evaluation, and inference, it's time to take a look at conceptualization. Now we're going to take a step back to another very, very important educational model here. This is Kolb's reflective cycle. And although the cycle itself may not be familiar to you, although it has been around for quite some time, I'm sure that the principles will be quite familiar to you. Starting at the top, if we look at concrete experience, okay, this is where we do something, we have an experience, and we move to reflective observation. We think about that experience, we kind of give it a bit of analysis, we review it, we reflect on it. Then comes the stage of abstract conceptualization. We draw conclusions from the experience and what we've considered in our reflection of those experiences, and we take that forward further into active experimentation, where we plan about trying what we have learnt from that experience, the reflection and the conceptualization. We may put it back into practice, or we may do something quite different. Now, this sounds like it's quite a high concept thing, but it's something that you do all the time. Let's take the example of going out for a meal with friends. You go to a restaurant and you have what you think is a fantastic meal, but the concrete experience ends badly. You get terrible dysentery and become very ill. So you reflect on it. You think, well, it was because I ate that meal. You conceptualize in thinking, I don't think I'm going to go to that restaurant again. And your active experimentation in this case would be to avoid that restaurant like the plague. Of course, we can apply this to positive experiences where we have a good experience, we reflect on it being good, we think, well, I'm going to use the same things, materials, tools, whatever it is I use to have that experience, and you try it out again, perhaps augmenting something just to improve on it or making better. But what we're interested in today is to look at the specific area in Kolb's reflective cycle of conceptualization and how that can really help us to take things forward, where we conclude from our experiences, we reflect on it in a meaningful way, and therefore we're able to experiment further. So, what is conceptualization according to the Oxford Dictionary Online? It's the action or process of forming a concept or idea of something, an abstract idea or concept of something. But this doesn't exist in a vacuum, it cannot be on its own, and we have to incorporate all of those steps of Kolb's reflective cycle in order to be able to conceptualize. Another definition from Kolb and McCarthy is that conceptualizing is the transition and synthesis of experiences, conceptual forms, language, and symbols into abstract terms and generalizations. And that's an extract from A Pedagogy of Multiliteracies by Calances and Co. And it's with their ideas that we move into the culmination of this session, where we look at a final model from their learning by design ideas, and that focuses on their knowledge processes. As you can see, this is a radial model, and the first place we're going to start is in the top left, experiencing the known, which involves drawing on familiar life world experiences, their prior knowledge, community background, personal interests, and cultural resources of learners. Examples might be sharing about favourite video games, brainstorming what students already know about a topic, or using popular multimedia text in the classroom. Staying with experience but looking at the external part of this is experiencing the new. And this is immersion in unfamiliar, whether it's real or simulated, experiences, communities, situations, and texts. Next up, we look at conceptualizing by naming, which involves categorizing and grouping particulars together based on their similarities, despite also having differences, potentially using psycholinguistic theory about the naming concepts, which would be something that you would hear about in Vygotsky. Externally, we look at conceptualizing by theorizing, where learners must use a language of generalization involving explicit, systematic, and conscious understandings to create a logically coherent exposition. Next, we are analyzing functionally, where learners might analyze the overarching function of media texts that they read or view, making connections between and across modes. Following that, we would look externally to them analysing critically, where they analyse the explicit and implicit agendas and interests behind the text. For example, whether it's a video game, a billboard graphic, or an internet fan site, or something similar to that. And then we look at application, which brings us almost full circle. On the inside, we're applying appropriately, which involves acting upon knowledge learnt in a typical way. For example, following genre styles or community cultures, whether that's a discourse community where people speak in the same way together, genres where people tend to appreciate the same kind of tastes culturally. And finally, on the external side, we have applying creatively, which takes knowledge from one setting and adapts it to a new setting, hopefully in a radically different way. And this is where cultures get kind of pushed forwards. And there you have it. We've gone from Bloom's taxonomy, which is the go-to model for education and the steps of learning. We've taken it through the definitions of critical thinking and looking at how we can apply particularly analysis, evaluation, inference through a reflective cycle, including abstract conceptualization, which leads to our own active experimentation. And finally, we've looked at this model for knowledge processes, where we have the internal domains experiencing the known, leading to experiencing the new, conceptualizing by naming and conceptualizing with theory, analyzing functionally and analyzing critically, and applying appropriately and applying creatively. If we can apply these things to ourselves in terms of how we develop as teachers, then we can certainly begin to apply these to our teaching and hopefully pass that down to our learners. Thank you very much for your time today. These are the references that were used in today's presentation. Goodbye.